What's up guys, this is going to be playing versus river probes population analysis. So we're imagining we're in the situation where we're facing a river probe, want to know how we should be defending on average. So we're going to be interested in things such as the bluff-to-value ratio when the population probe bets the river. And we're also, as you're going to see, going to be especially interested in how often the population is folding to a raise after probe betting the river. So let's pull up our range research. This is the 200 nel stars data that we're using right now. If we go to the flop c-bet in position breakdown, we can have a look at, in fact, we want folded to c-bet OP. Let's start off with the right pop-up. And we have the probe river data for the population there. So you can see player pool is probing the river 52% of the time. And in terms of a very basic analysis, before we break down by profile and other metrics, we can see bet fold frequency after probe bet river is 60%. Now, we said in the theory module that we should expect a break-even raise. That was evidently based on data from a softer room where there were more fish. And when we run the profile analysis, we can see that it's actually the fish profiles that don't really fold as much when they probe bet the river. It ends up being kind of break even against a recreational when they probe bet the river and we decide to go for a bluff raise. But when we take a slightly more mature player pool, so 200 nel stars in this case, we can see that not only is it not break even, we have very significant automatic profit on the raise. Now, this is not super new information in the sense that some of the better stables and CFP programs out there are aware of this, but the average player doesn't know this. Like a lot of the auto profit spots, I guess. This is not completely revolutionary information, but only a small number of players actually know about it, and it's very powerful if the player pool is folding 60%. So step number one is have a look at your player pool. How much are they folding versus a raise after they probe bet the river? Because before we even look at the bluff to value ratios, we could see that if we don't have a hand that's going to be a candidate for a bluff catcher, we should be raising in this spot. Now, if we just hop on over to the fold to c-bet OP and 3-bet pots, just before we do that, in case you're wondering what kind of frequencies we need here in order for this to be profitable, well, break even is going to be somewhere around 50%, maybe slightly above if you factor in rake. When it gets to 55, you're generating profit. Might not be a lot of profit, but you do have a profitable bluff raise. It's definitely slightly better than break even. When it's 60, now this just means the player pool is exploitable. And we're not really incentivized to fold anything against a river probe bet against most opponents. But we'll reserve judgment until we see the profile-based analysis of this. But right now, in terms of default strategy versus an unknown, it appears that we should just be bluffing like crazy when they probe bet the river. Bluff raising, that is, and specifically with a hand that's not strong enough to bluff catch. Let's have a look at the fold to c-bet OP and 3-bet pots pop up. Let's have a look at the probe river data here. Now, the interesting thing about this is we have what appears to be an even more significant amount of automatic profit on the raise versus river probe. Now, this is a line that we maybe don't execute much, i.e. before you've been exposed to this information, but really should be looking to find spots. The reason why I say up until now you probably haven't used this line too much is because sometimes it can feel a little bit of a weird line, like you have to decide based on the size of villain's probe bet compared to the current stack to pot ratio, whether the raise is going to be something like a 2.2x river raise or whether it's going to be an all-in shove. So there's definitely not a hard and fast rule in terms of, yes, this should be a 2.5x raise. It depends on the SPR on the river. Yeah, that's right, Yon. I'm on the 3-bet pot fold. You can see fold to c-bet OP, and then we've got in brackets 3B for 3-bet, right? We've just looked at single raised. Now we're looking at 3-bet pots. So the point is, whether it's single raised or 3-bet pot, we have a profitable bluff raise against a river probe bet. So this is something we should be doing in 3-bet pots as well. It's also something, when you think about this is very, very powerful in the sense that, let's say we are playing a 3-bet pot in position, because this is really what this is applying to from our perspective. It basically means that we're going to be c-betting the flop with a very wide range. And anytime we don't double barrel the turn, because we have trash, we're not giving up on the pot, or at least we shouldn't be according to this data, because either we have a hand that's good enough to bluff catch, or we should be bluff raising the river. In other words, we virtually just don't give up in this spot. Imagine how good that's going to be for red line. Now, if you think about the other situation, which we don't want to touch on too much because it's kind of outside the scope of this session, which is we don't see bet the flop in position, we actually check back when we face a turn probe bet and river follow-up bet. Well, we also have automatic profit on a raise against a river follow-up bet. So spoiler alert for another session there. If you put everything together, we basically just don't give up very much in 3-bet pots in position. Because either we have a value hand, or we have something that's good enough to bluff catch, or we have something that's not good enough to bluff catch and is going to be turned into a bluff raise a lot of the time. Now, that doesn't mean we are never giving up, because an example scenario would be we check back the flop and in a 3-bet pot in position, and we have trash on the turn and face a turn probe bet. In that situation, we just fold to the turn probe bet. So in order to bluff raise the river against the follow-up line, we still need a hand that has the right criteria to defend against the turn probe bet. So you can see we're not completely invincible here. We have to give up some of the time, but if you think about our give up frequency, it can actually be very low once we're aware of some of these bluff lines we can execute even in 3-bet pots. Now, if we return back to the single raised information, we're still looking at the generic data. We haven't broken it down by profile yet. I want to start having a look at this bluff to value ratio for the probe bet. Now, generally speaking, probe bet river is really one of the overbluffed parts of the game tree. In fact, if I just bring this up right now, you can see 40% weak. So without breaking it down by sizing or texture or anything like that, this data is essentially telling us the bluff to value ratio here is 40% bluff, 60% value. That's ignoring the fact that there's going to be some merging going on. So we're kind of treating it like a polarized range when in reality it's not going to be perfectly polarized. There's going to be some mid-strength hands betting there. And you can really see that. There's things like low pair and mid pair pro-betting the river. So it's not a polarized range, even though it potentially should be. That 40% means that when our opponent probes the river, they're going to have low pair or worse 40% of the time. If we add up those values, we have 13, 7, that's 20, 40, 41. So you can see 41%. Obviously the 1% is a rounding issue. So it's rounded in a different direction to the 40% weak. But you can see that this is a heavily overbluffed spot. Now, if we imagine that on average, we're going to need, if we make a really conservative estimate, we could say we need as much as 35% equity to bluff catch. Now, that's technically too tight. If we were waiting until we had 35% equity, we would be falling a bit more often than we should be relative to GTO, for example. But we don't really care too much about that. It's going to be partly good for our mindset not to bluff catch too wide, because we're going to be losing a lot when we bluff catch in these kind of spots. Obviously, we're still going to be losing 60, 65% at the time. But of course, if you want to push this closer to the line, you can. That's completely fine. Let's work with 35% as a boundary for this and say we're going to need at least 35% equity to bluff catch on average. So we're just talking average at the moment. We haven't broken it down by sizing. So we've got 21% air, 7% ace high, that's 28. Plus the 13% low pair. Well, what you can see is we're getting already pretty close, right? So 28 plus the 31, that's going to take us to 41%, which has overshot our target. In other words, somewhere in this low pair category, like somewhere about halfway, is where we start to bluff catch. And that's our tight estimation of what to bluff catch with, okay? That's like giving ourselves an extra 5% leeway, which you could argue we don't really need. And, you know, we're really just doing that for mindset reasons. But you could bluff catch. Essentially, you could bluff catch all bottom pairs in this situation according to this data. We like to factor in a bit for mindset, a bit for uncertainty, a bit for rake, a little bit for card removal, stuff like that. So let's say something like 35%. That means that we should still be bluff catching low pair a decent amount of the time against a river probe bet. And it means that folding mid pair is just ridiculously out of the question in this scenario. Okay, so we're going to break this data down in a few different ways. So we want to have a look at some profile-based analysis. In fact, let's have a look, since we've got this data here, let's have a look at the texture and formational analysis first. So let's start off with texture. we have an average bluff catching target, which is every second pair plus and bottom pair a decent amount of the time. Like half of our bottom pair should bluff catch. It's going to depend on the texture actually, as hopefully we'll find out. If we have a bottom pair that's not strong enough to bluff catch, we should be bluff raising. If we have air, we should be bluff raising. So we're really just not following against river pro bets, period. It's just not something that's going to make sense unless we're maybe playing against a very specific profile and a very specific run out. And that's what we're going to try and fine tune right now. Let's just start looking very generally on the different runouts and how often the river pro better is weak based on those runouts. So we can see overcard 41 weak, non-overcard 40, flush completes. All right, so we often equate this to draws complete in general. We of course lack the functionality with Hand2Note to have a draws complete category, so we have to make do with flush completes. But just know that whatever this value is, it's probably going to be lower if we had a full draws complete type of filter. So rather than 37 week, it could say something like 34 week, for example. If we have a look specifically at the breakdown for flush completes, let's see at which point we have 35% equity. Well, we've got air 18%, ace high 6%, that's 24. Then we've got 14% for low pair, so that's going to take us to 38%. So even on a draw completing run out, it seems that bottom pair is a candidate for being bluff catched. Now, it probably makes sense to just bluff catch mid pair and better in this kind of spot and maybe turn all low pairs into a bluff to be safe. But generally, we can still bluff catch pretty wide, even on flush completes. When we get to 4 flush and 4 straights, now you might notice that these are very low in terms of how often their opponent's weak. It's like 32% weak. So we need to reevaluate our relative hand strength on these kind of board textures. So if you have a look at 4 flushes, this is probably obvious to some extent that your bottom pair is nowhere near as good of a bluff catcher on a board that has 4 to a flush out there. Let's have a look at what we can bluff catch in this situation. So 4 to flush just gets there in the river. Let's add these up till we get to 35. We've got 16 plus 16 for low pair, that gets us to 32. Mid pair gets us to 36. So we should still potentially be bluff catching top pair and better on 4 flushes. And I'm guessing 4 straights might be quite similar just because the is weak value is similar. So we have 19 for air and ace high, and then 12% for low pair. That's going to take us to 31. And then mid pair is going to take us to about 36. So you can bluff catch top pair on 4 straights, 4 flushes, etc. If I have a look at the double pairs, so these are obviously unorthodox runouts now. You can see that our opponent's actually bluffing 31% of the time in this case, and that you should be bluff catching ace high some of the time in this spot. If you have any pair, you should be calling if it's a double paired texture. Obviously, when we say any pair, you want to make sure your pair is not counterfeited. Okay, if we have a look at the slightly other end of the spectrum now, so that was flush complete, and you can see flush bricks. So these are going to be our ideal bluff catching zones, is when everything seems to brick. There's not too much coordination. You can see the general trend here. The more coordinated the board is by the river, the tighter our bluff catching range has to be. That should hopefully not be a big surprise or anything like that. So when we have a board texture where everything's bricked, this is going to be even better for bluff catching. So let's see how wide we can bluff catch on the flush bricks according to the Hand2Note data. We've got air 23, ace high 8, that takes us to 31. And we're getting pretty similar results. It's a larger amount of the low pairs. So when we had the flush completing river, it was maybe some low pairs, but they didn't look that attractive, so we could just bluff catch mid pair plus. And now it's most of the low pairs, but the bottom or the absolute worst low pairs might not quite be good enough. You know, if we were to filter out all of the 4 flush and 4 straight and other types of draw completing from this particular output, then it probably would be any low pair. So just keep that in mind, that your bluff catching range is probably going to start somewhere around bottom pair. Depending on how draw completing the board is, it might end up being only the best low pairs, or it could even be mid pair plus. Whereas if everything bricks, it's probably going to be the majority of low pairs need to bluff catch in this situation. Okay, just let me know if you have any questions, guys. So that was the runout analysis. We're also probably slightly interested in texturally as well. So if we have a look at texture. So what was the difference between runout and texture? Just a quick recap. Texture is more to do with the initial flop setup, whereas we were just talking about Runout, which is, is it a high card? What kind of river card is it? So now let's just think about flops. Now, one thing we know is that our opponent is going to be the cold caller out of position. So we generally expect them to, at least on the flop, we generally expect them to be favoring the mid-range connected textures. Now, let's have a look at what happens to their probing frequency, first of all. So if it's a code red, this is one of the ones that they're meant to connect hard with. They've got 50% river probe, dynamics 51, semi-dry 51, dry 51, monotone 50, paired dynamic. So paired is more likely to be, well, it's a high frequency. I don't want to just jump to a conclusion and say it's more likely to be a bluff, because that's 39 weak. Whereas code red, let's have a look. That's 36 weak. All right. Dynamic, 41 weak. So you think it's code red, like the draws have already got there. I guess dynamic, there could be some bricked runouts on the dynamic where just nothing gets there. So that's 41 weak. Semi-dry, 41 weak as well. Could be some busted draws there as well. Dry, 46 weak. So was that the highest? I think that may have been the highest on the dry texture. We'll also do this by high cards as well, just to see if we can spot any pattern. But basically, it does seem slightly trending towards the textures that they shouldn't like as much as the cold cooler. They're more likely to be bluffing on, right? That seems to be the trend so far. So code red got 36, they're not bluffing too much. Dynamic is slightly more at 41. Semi-dry, 41. When it gets to dry, which is presumably what they don't want, they're now 46% weak. Okay. Monotone. Interestingly, if the flop was mono, they're not really that likely to be bluffing the river. But then again, I guess that's because some percentage of the runouts are going to be those 4 flush runouts, and we just have seen that we're not really seeing too many bluffs there. Paired dynamics, so you can kind of see, we should expect to see a difference between these two. So paired dry is 43, whereas paired dynamic, which they're going to connect with a bit more, and it's going to have some draw completing rivers, I guess. And they're bluffing a little bit less. Let's have a look in terms of high card now. So if we're to predict the trend here, well, let's just see. Because ace high looks pretty low there at 34 weak. King high, 38 weak. Queen to jack high, 41 weak. 10 to 9 high, 45 weak. And low, 47 weak. So actually what we're seeing here is that the lower textures are more likely to be bluffed with the river probe, but the low dry textures are actually the best, ironically. The high card textures are not really likely to run into a bluff that much. Presumably, even if they could be somewhat dry. But if it's a draw completing run out with a high card, you're just not going to be facing a lot of bluffs in that kind of spot. If it's a low texture, and it's a dry texture, those are like some of the really good metrics to be looking for in terms of being able to bluff cards. Okay, so might take some time to assimilate that data. Might be worth watching this again at some point and just trying to get your head around that. But that's the trend that we've seen, is that dry runouts, the river pro bet bluff is higher. Low runouts, the river pro bet bluff is higher. In fact, that does seem to be a relatively clear trend. So you've got 35 ace high, 38 for king high, queen to jack high is 41, 10-9 high is 45. Like, we definitely have enough data here where this is a very clear trend that we're spotting. Okay. Hopefully everything makes sense so far. So let's move on. Now, if we have a look at some formation analysis as well. So if we head over to positional and just see how often our opponent's bluffing. What we'd normally expect to see here is that the late position battles, we have a higher bluffing frequency for the river probe bet just because the initial setup of the ranges was wider for the cold caller pre-flop. So let's see if we can demonstrate that or whether we find something different. So big blind versus button, this is obviously going to be late position. So we should expect slightly higher probe bet frequencies here. That doesn't look super high at 38. We've definitely seen higher values. BB versus cutoff is going to be late position as well. So let's have a look. 39. So we've got 38 and 39. Now we're getting into the slightly earlier position battles. We've got 37, so it does seem a little bit lower. We've got 39. It doesn't seem to me like there's really a big difference there. There might be a slight trend to it being a bit more aggressive in late position, but the frequencies look pretty similar. Small blind versus button. Now that's that's quite high, 46 weak. So I wonder if that's an anomaly. One thing that we kind of run into here is we have to always take the small blind data a bit tentatively in these kind of spots, because especially if you're looking at a reg pool, what you find is there are often enough regs that just don't have a cold calling range from the small blind that we end up with this warped data set where you either don't have a big enough sample on the small blind, or you end up looking at a subset of the population which is mostly fish, because proportionally, if someone's cold calling a lot from the small blind, it's just that much more likely it's a recreational profile. And we're probably going to see that those guys over bluff in this spot quite significantly. So you can see a big spike there for the small blind. So I guess it could just be a general rule. I mean, let's just check the other data points here. That's higher as well. Small blind versus cusp of 44, 43, and 44. So there's an interesting lesson here, an interesting extrapolation of this data, which is we might imagine that when someone's cold calling out of the small blind, they're going to have a stronger range in general, and therefore they're going to have a less bluff heavy river pro bet range. Okay, that would be logical, all right? Tighter starting range in the small blind, therefore less likely to bluff when they pro bet the river. But what we actually see is that because any given player who cold calls in the small blind is more likely to be a recreational player, that we should be bluff catching a lot wider against river pro bets from the small blind than we do against the big blind, all right? So that's really an interesting metric we take away from this. It's very specific to this situation. But if you're not sure what type of opponent you're facing, if he's cold calling out the small blind, he's that much more likely to be a fish. Whereas in the big blind, we just don't know. It's still going to be an unknown. So we get much higher population bluffing frequencies in the small blind. Okay. Let's have a look now at some of the profile analysis. Before we do this, we're just going to recap on the basic data again. So we've got Pro Bet River 52. In fact, we'll write some of this down just so we can compare it at the end. So we're just going to take a note on three things here, really. We're going to take a note on Pro Bet River frequency, the bet fold frequency, and let me just make sure, and this is not the average data, so let's get back to the average data. This is still broken down by position. We remember that it's going to be 60% bet fold here, so I'm going to take track of Pro River frequency, the Bluff-to-value ratio, so is weak value for the different profiles, and then we're going to have a look at the bet fold for different profiles. So let's see if we can get everything on one screen. This may or may not work, but if not, we can always keep the notes on the other screen. So here's our note document. And if we just take a quick note on the basic data, so this is going to be the average tendencies. So we have Pro River, 52%. Bet Fold, 60%. And if we have a look at the Bluff-to-value ratio, because the is weak, 40%. We'll just call it is bluff, but just remember there's some merging that goes on, that kind of thing. So this is not the whole picture. This is just how often they have low pair or worse when they pro bet the river. Okay, so we'll call it is bluff, but that's probably slightly simplistic because it almost implies it's polarized when it's not. There's a lot of merging that goes on, as we can see. Now, if we have a look at some of these other profiles, they may take a second or two to load. Let's start with the pink tag profile. Now, our prediction here is going to be that these guys bluff a lot more, but ironically, even though they bluff a lot more, they don't necessarily fold a huge amount. So we'll test that prediction right now. I mean, I haven't checked this data set specifically, so we don't know. That's just our prediction. So first of all, Pro River. You can see straight away that the Pro River frequency is slightly higher. The bet fold is lower, so you can see it's 56%. Having said that, that's still clearly in the auto-profit territory. We're not making as much now at 56% fold, but it is above the automatic profit threshold. So you can technically bluff raise against one of these pink tags at 200 now. I would still be wary about doing it because it could just be the way the data is, or it could be specific to 200 now. So you might want to check with your own player pool. But right now, this is saying that we can bluff raise at 56. If it's close to 50, which you might find when you run your own range research, then you probably just don't want to bluff raise because we're either breaking even or we're losing slightly to the rig, something like that. let's have a look at the is weak. So this is going to be hopefully quite interesting. 45 is weak this time. So we can see a noticeable increase to the bluffing frequency there from 40% to 45. I mean, just to put that into perspective here, if we just have a look at the breakdown, so we've got air 21, ace high 8%, that's 29. I mean, ironically, same kind of thing. I mean, we can call some low pairs, but not all of them. We're just going to be doing a bit more calling against the pink tag. You can also see that these guys just have, it seems, I could be imagining things, but it seems like there's a much larger amount of low pairs in here as well. And there's more merging going on. So pink tag's always just going to bet stuff that doesn't make sense. So we might intuitively realize that if we're in the pro bet situation that we want to be firing some hands for value and some hands as a bluff, and then everything in the middle we're going to check. Whereas this profile is just going to be betting for random reasons. Some of the time there's going to be less polarization to this range. So aside from the is weak category, you can see that there's a lot of mid pairs that are betting there, and those hands probably don't make any sense. So obviously, like a top pair is going to be good even more frequently than a mid pair is going to be, because a pink tag going to have those merges in their range. Alex K says, what is the precise method of adding rate to the calculations? There is no precise method unless you have a specific instance of a pot. And we don't have that here. We're actually dealing with hundreds of thousands of pots at the same time. So there's not an easy way to calculate the rake. So what you could do is you could have a specific situation and figure out how much rake is being paid in that spot, and maybe make an assumption it's going to be somewhat similar. But you can only count specific amounts of rake for individual hands. You can't do it for the range research report like we're looking at now. So it'd be a simple case of having a sample hand, looking at the rake structure that the poker room provides, and then seeing how much rake would be paid in that spot. We won't do that right now. It's not going to be a large impact anyway. I mean, we're talking about a couple of percent in most cases. But the point is it's there and it's non-zero. I think that's the key takeaway. So we just make estimates. There are other issues as well, which is the data we're looking at right now, and this is maybe slightly a bigger factor than the rake, is that all of the hands we're seeing here where our opponent has shown their holding at showdown, there's some skewage there. So we don't necessarily see, there's like a card removal effect. So we don't necessarily get to see their actual ranges. And what's going to happen is if they have a value hand in this spot, because of the card removal effect they're exerting on the defender, and we're actually less likely to see their hand at showdown, right? You know, if they're value betting top set, then it's less likely we have a bluff catcher that we can call with. They're going to get more folds. So what's going to end up happening is there's also this, 2 or 3% skewage where when you look at a range research report, they're not actually bluffing as often as they appear to be. And that's another effect that you have to quantify. And it's quite difficult to quantify it over a large data set. You could maybe hope to quantify it over an individual hand, but even that's quite complex. So rather than wasting a bunch of time with this, what we do is, or what I recommend that we do, is simply what we've done in this session, which is just add an arbitrary amount, which hopefully covers most of our bases, which was about 5% in this case. So that's not just for covering rake. That's for covering rake. That's to cover the skewage. And there's also a little bit, if there's any extra, then we just kind of put it down to this is good for our mindset, because we're not just bluff catching very, very wide too much of the time. And I would say, depending on the setup of your mindset, you might add more of a buffer. Like if you don't have a great mindset and you're not very good at losing lots of pots when you bluff catch, you might decide to bluff catch with a tighter range. Okay, technically your strategy is lower EV, but if it's good for your mindset, it could end up being higher EV in the long run because you're not tilting as much, that kind of thing. So don't worry too much about specific calculations. Just know that you need some kind of buffer when working on bluff catching decisions. And exactly how big that buffer is probably going to be partly a function of your mindset, but it also needs to cover rake effects, skewage effects. And I sometimes say a little bit for uncertainty as well, just in case like our data is wrong. I don't mean wrong, but obviously this can vary over the sample size as well, right? You know, this player pool's falling 60% when they probe at the river. That seems kind of high, but maybe they're not really falling that. Maybe the data is, you know, slightly skewed because of sample size. So you have to cover all of these things with a little bit of a buffer here when making bluff catches. Another way of saying that is we want to err on the side of caution here in this case. It's better to bluff catch slightly too tight because there could be something we've missed, that kind of thing. All right, let's check out the other profiles. So that was the pink tag. Let's have a look at the green tag. Okay, so we have probe river 51. So it's actually less aggressive than the pink or red tag. And the bet fold is 46. Is that right? No, 57. So again, still pretty high. It's not as high as the red tag, but so I would normally be, if I was playing, let's say 25 NL, I'd probably be a bit cautious about bluffing the pink and green tags. But at 200 NL stars, it seems that you should just be bluffing everyone, and it's just very profitable. So where that starts, I don't know. Does that start at 50 NL, 100 NL? Difficult to say. This is why it's good to run your own range research. But right now, it just looks like we should just bluff raise a lot against everyone when they probe bet the river, including 3-bet pots. Okay, and let's have a look at the is weak. So these guys often still bluff a bit more than the reg. Let's have a look. In this case, they are actually bluffing slightly less. You can see is bluff 38%. So I think one thing we might take away from that is I guess the average reg does know that this is a good bluff spot if you're specifically looking at stars 200 now, because this is significantly over bluffed. I mean, the GTO value here for bluff should be more like 28-30% and it's 40. So is this an accident? No, this is probably like the average reg at stars 200 knowing that you can pull a trigger on this bluff, which is what produces this high bet fold value. Okay, let's have a look now at the cyan tags. So these guys have wider ranges in general. They're also regs. So maybe the data is going to be similar to red tag. Let's find out. So we have probe river 48. That's actually the lowest of them all, which is kind of interesting. Bet fold. Wow, look at that. 65% bet fold river. So that's kind of insane. So they don't bet as much, but they fold more when they do bet. And I guess that's just testament to having the wide range to begin with. But look at that. This is 30% weak. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a little bit of a counterintuitive result. I'm not sure how much I trust that, because unless these guys are just playing like GTO or something like that, it doesn't quite make sense. So I'm going to only trust that tentatively, and I'm going to assume that. Well, it could also be that the red tags are not really bluffing 40%. Something doesn't quite gel with this data. I'd probably like question whether this is actually representative, just because we wouldn't expect there to be this much of a gap between the red and the cyan tag. And if there was a gap, we'd expect the cyan tag to be bluffing slightly more than the red tag because they have that wider range. So I'm not sure if like the red tag data, actually that was average, that wasn't red tag, my bad. So that's probably what's going on here then. So we're seeing pretty low bluffing frequencies for the cyan tag then. So let's just pull up red tag then. So if I referred to that first one as red tag, then that was a mistake. This is average tendencies, obviously. And we're seeing that pink tag's above average, and we're seeing the cyan tag is below average. So when I was saying, I guess the average reg knows about the bluff spot, well, this is not the average reg, okay? So just to clarify that. And I wouldn't say this necessarily means that the average player knows about this bluff spot, just because it could just be more a case of them pulling triggers without really understanding what's going on. I think when we look at the red tag result, it will probably clear things up slightly. So probe river 48. I probably should have written which profiles were which. In fact, let's do that now. So this is just everyone. This was the pink tag, I believe. This was the green tag. This is the cyan tag. And we're looking at the red tag data right now. So probe river 48. So what we can see then is the reg profiles actually just probe bet the river less. So we've got 48 for the red tag and 48 for the cyan tag. Okay, so this makes more sense. We would expect them to be kind of similar. Let's see bet fold 61. All right, so you can see it's very high, 61%. So you can see both of these profiles are folding more than the average. And everyone's just folding a lot according to this data. But what you can maybe get at the lower limits is these are the only guys that are really folding enough to make it worthwhile. And they're not folding 61 and 65. So it does seem that actually the higher up in limits you go, the more of an exploitative opportunity you have here. Ironically, this line works slightly better at the higher limits, it seems. And then let's have a look at the bluff to value ratio, which I'm hoping or guessing is going to be kind of chilled out here. Let's find out. Yeah, look at that, 29. So just to rephrase what we were saying earlier incorrectly, it seems that the average reg either doesn't know about this bluff spot then, or they're not taking advantage of it. Because if this is all the red tags in the population and they're bluffing 29%, which is very close to a GTO value, this just means they don't know that they should be bluffing more. And you can say, well, you know, they're just better. They know that they should be balanced in this player pool. But we've seen that that's incorrect. Like, people are folding a lot to river probe bets in this player pool. It's a very, very powerful bluff spot. So this is just actually an example of bad regulars in the player pool. Like, on average, this red tag, these are not good players because they should be bluffing more if they were decent. Even the cyan tags are not really bluffing very much. If you look at the database of, let's say, Jedi Academy member who's been around the Academy long enough to absorb a decent amount of the materials, you will not have 30% bluff. You'll have something like 40 or even 50% is weak here. So you'll be bluffing even more than the pink tags in this spot. Okay, so with the orange tags, I don't think we really find too many orange tags in this player pool, but what we typically expect to see is basically lower is bluff frequencies. You could end up with something like 20% is bluff here. They'll probably still fold a decent amount. And you might think, well, why are they still folding when they have a much stronger betting range? It's just because they're also capable of laying down much stronger holdings in the face of a raise, kind of thing. Right, so in summary even, NL200, we should just bluff raise against everyone, basically. If you run the same analysis on NL50 or NL25, what you might find is that we should bluff against these two profiles, but not bluff against these two profiles. Now, of course, you might find that you can still bluff against a pink tag if all of the other variables line up. So it's going to be a good run out for it, that kind of thing. Okay, let's move on to the sizing. So what we want to do here is just get an idea for how often the player pool's folding after they use different river probe bet sizings. So we want to get a feel for what these probe bet sizings actually mean. So if I look at the bet sizing when they probe, and what we can do is we can have a look at this next action feature. Now, just looking at this, I'm not sure whether this is converging. I think there may be some convergence issues with the slightly less orthodox sizings here. So once it gets to like 80% pot plus, I don't know whether the data is really converging here. What we're looking at here, in just in case you're wondering, like, what are we even looking at? We're looking at these FCR values over on the right-hand side. So this is the probe sizing. We've got less than 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80 pot, 80 to 100% pot. And then over on the right-hand side here, we have these FCR values. And that stands for next action, fold, call, and raise. So this is how often their next action is fold, given that the probe sizing was less than 20% pot in this case. So we can see 38% folds after probe betting less than 20% pot. Now, that doesn't seem like it's a especially good bluff, but then you can see this little 8 here, which means this is actually a sample size of 8. And we hopefully realize there's just not enough of a sample for that to be useful. Once we get to pot size, we can see a sample size of 5. Interestingly, there's more of a sample on the overbets. There's 10 sample on the overbets. So we can only really work with these middle values. But if we had to make a prediction based on other things we've seen, it's that you probably don't want to be bluff raising against the pot size bets. Having said that, in some of the other data analysis that I've seen with other students where we've run range research, surprisingly, you can still profitably bluff raise against pot size probe bets in that specific data set. So we can't promise that that holds true on average, but let's just say you might be surprised at how many different bluffs you can actually pull a trigger on here, even against like large probe bets where you think, well, that guy must be strong, he's betting pot size. Let's just look at the data we can work with from this data set. And there's only 3 values we can really trust here. That's 60 to 80, 40 to 60, 20 to 40. I can see 20 to 40, we've got 59 full equity on the raise, 65 and 64. I would say for all intents and purposes that these numbers are very similar. And you might think, well, okay, they're not the same. Like this is 5% different. That's true, but the price on the bluff raise is going to be different as well. So people might use different multiples and average against a 35% pot size bet compared to the multiple they'd use against a 70% size bet, for example. So you might find that, you know, the smaller sizing, the raise against that just doesn't need to work as often or something along those lines. So I would say they all look pretty similar. You definitely should feel okay bluff raising against anything from 0 to 80% pot. 80% pot onwards, I would say it depends on the population, and although you see some, like I say, I've seen some results indicate you can still bluff raise against the larger sizings, I would probably just be very cautious and, you know, give a lot of credit to pot size river probes, not really bluff raise too much. Right, let's have a look at some of the questions you guys have written. BBW says, do you think there is a difference between same VPIP PFR pink tag, the different limits? Let's say 70-30 guy at 2 canal and same with 15L. I assume the only difference is their BKR, whatever that is. Bankroll, maybe. I assume their game is the same. Yeah, I mean, of course, they're going to be wildly different. And I think that's the point. There's no specific trend for a 200L pink tag versus a 25L pink tag, alright? That they're all just people who don't really know how to play poker is the bottom line. So there's no difference in some sense. There's no difference in the sense that the differences are equivalent. But also there are differences just because 2 pink tags are probably not similar. They're just also wildly different from what they should be doing in different unique ways. So they are different, but basically a pink tag is a pink tag. Whether you meet that pink tag at 2KNL or 5NL online, you're probably going to treat them in pretty much the same way. What kind of value of bet and fold are we looking for to make the bluff raising? We're not looking at that. We're looking at their fold frequency against the raise. We don't care what their distribution is actually when we think about bluff raising. We only care whether they're folding enough to make the bluff raise profitable. And like we said at the beginning of the session, if they are folding more than 55% of the time, then bluff raising is profitable. It doesn't matter what the distribution is. I mean, the distribution could be 100% value, but if they fold 60% of that against the raise, then we would still bluff raise. So the distribution doesn't make any difference for us. There probably is a correlation there where the more they're bluffing, the more they fold, potentially. But we're just primarily interested in how much do they fold. Is it above the auto profit threshold? That's the only thing we really care about in this case. Right, I wouldn't mind just going back to 3-bet pots, but we're getting pretty close to the end of this now, guys, so if you have any questions, then just let me know. Let's just see if we can dig in a little bit deeper. Firstly, actually, let's just take a quick look at 4-bet pots, see if we have any data whatsoever. Let's have a look at the bluff-to-value ratio on the probe river in 4-bet pots. So this is someone who's called a 4-bet OP. We can see they are 29 weak. The only weird thing we have to deal with here is the average sizing could potentially be a little bit larger. And you can see we're just unfortunately not really getting enough of a sample size to break this down by sizing. Having said that, this doesn't look especially good. Let's just see what we should be calling. If we do just add them up anyway. Well, according to that diagram, we actually need top pair top kicker to call. I think this is probably very often going to be an all-in bet. And the data seems to be leaning towards top pair top kicker, so I wouldn't worry too much about really bluff catching too much. We're not really going to have any info on bet fold here just because the stacks are going to be already all in with such a high frequency, there's going to be no sample here. So probe river, fold 204. And this is a pretty big database and we hardly have any sample. So let's go back to 3-bet pots now. Fold to c-bet OP and 3-bet pots. Okay, and if we can maybe just have a look at the fish profiles in the 3-bet pots as well. So what we're looking at, or what we're going to look at when we've loaded it up, is we're going to have a look at how often the fish are falling to the raise in a 3-bet pot after they probe. So profile-based analysis specific to 3-bet pots now. So probe river 57 and then bet fold 59. So that's very high even for the pink tags. So it feels like the red tags just must be falling a huge amount in this situation. So let's have a look at the red tags in 3-bet pots. Yeah, look at that. Probe river 48, bet fold 71, which is just completely insane really in terms of falling frequency. Let's just open up a hand just out of curiosity, just to see what's going down. So he's actually going to call the raise here, but this is like a river probe situation. Okay, so reg check calls a flop, check check, probes a river. So you can see small sizing. So imagine we're in this situation. Okay, so imagine we're on the button. We've just 3-bet pre-flop. I guess we could have like ace king, ace queen, something like that. We decide to not double barrel because we didn't pick up equity. That's fine. And we face this river lead here. And, you know, we have ace king, ace queen, ace x suited, something like that. Well, we should actually be raising here in this spot. Now, because it's a 1/3 lead, I would imagine that the sizing should probably be something like 3x. And that's what the reg does here. He makes it around 3x. Actually, a little bit over 3x. I think this is pretty reasonable. If anything, he could probably get away with raising smaller. And I definitely think he could very easily be getting the right amount of folds here in this situation. You know, the 60% folds. We obviously don't expect ace-jack to be folded here. But this is probably a pretty good example of what we should be doing. So it's not necessarily always going to be an all-in situation in 3-bet pots as well. Because, you know, as you can see, this is actually pretty small action. Got the 1/3 c-bet. Then this guy decides to bluff lead river for 1/3. So there's really not too much in terms of like large investments going on here. I mean, it's still a chunk of the in-position player stack, I guess. Let's have a look at another spot. Okay, so this is cool OOP. Check call the flop. Yeah, so this is like another spot where you should definitely just be bluff raising, I guess. I always think this spot kind of feels insane. But the data just suggests it's very, very profitable. You know, maybe that's why it's profitable, because it just looks insane, like the in-position guy could just never ever be bluffing. I mean, who does this? So, yeah, what would I raise to here? Probably like 35 would be my guess. So once again, we're raising enough to get the job done, but we're not like making a large investment. You don't need to be shoving all in here in this situation or anything. So you can see there is room to raise. Now this, I think, is an example of what not to do. There's no need to invest this amount on a bluff because there's certain hands that villain's not folding. What is the objective of a raise here? It's really just to fold off overcard type stuff. You know, imagine we have a suited ace here in position and the OP guy has like ace-jack, ace-10, ace-queen, ace-king, all that kind of stuff. Imagine he's got like ace-king with the backdoor flush draw, ace-jack with the backdoor flush draw. Check, check, makes sense. He decides he's going to lead his hand as a bluff. He has an ace-queen, he wants to turn it into a bluff. He's got like a suited connector with backdoor equity like he had 10-9 of clubs at the flop. He decided to peel one off, now he has 10 high. Our objective is to fold out those hands. If you think about the sizing that we need to get that done with, and if we assume that he's never folding queens, this is actually a pretty bad raise sizing. So I'm pretty sure you could make this minus EV if you were using incorrect bet sizings. So there's really no guarantee this is going to be a plus EV bluff, just because, you know, some of the time the OP guy is going to have a full house, or he's going to have something that he's not folding, like queens in this case. And you're going to lose 80 big blinds rather than 35 big blinds. So I think this is potentially minus EV. But I think the idea is right, and I do think there should be a bluff raise here. Obviously, we can only see hands that went to showdown, so if you're wondering why all of these bluffs are failing, that's because we're only choosing hands that went to showdown, but we're not results oriented, so this was 1/3 c-bet, no barrels, and then ace on the river. Now, there's not... The interesting thing here, I guess, is that the in-position player shouldn't really have too many hands that he needs to turn into a bluff here, because it would kind of imply that he's either turning something to a bluff, which is going to be a good bluff catcher, you know, like ace-x suited, for example, which doesn't need to raise, or it would imply he was 3-betting too wide pre-flop, like with a suited connector, or it would imply he made a bad slow play on the turn. So this spot doesn't really make any sense. Like, there's... in terms of if we did somehow have one of these hands that we weren't really supposed to have, I suppose you could sometimes... You could be in a spot, I guess, where someone might play something like jacks this way and they just c-bet range on the flop. So that wouldn't be terrible. So if you imagine like tens or jacks, that might just about make sense. And those hands are now not quite strong enough to call against the river pro bet, although is pretty close. In fact, we'll just check that for 3-bet pots. So yeah, you could turn something like jacks, I guess, into a bluff. Sizing would be probably about 25 to 27. So it's another small action scenario. We can make it 3x. So I think this is like too large. It doesn't need to be this big. I'm not sure if we checked this, so just in case we didn't, let's just go back to the general data for 3-bet pots and just have a look at our bluff catching range versus river pro bets and 3-bet pots. Maybe we checked this at the beginning, maybe we didn't. And then this will probably be the last thing we check, so if you have any other questions, just let me know. So if you have a look at probe river, we can just get an average calling range, which is what we want to do. We'll use 35% again, but it could be slightly different in 3-bet pots if people are using different sizes on average. So we've got 27, 37. So although I think this data is potentially on the extreme side, if this is what someone's probing the river with in 3-bet pots, it's pretty much saying that we should still call low pair plus. In other words, that hand we looked at, if you have a second pair, you should really be calling against a river pro bet. I think it's one of those bluff catches which is obviously going to lose a lot and it's quite difficult. I mean, if you ever fold top pair against a river pro bet, then that's terrible. And it seems like you shouldn't really be folding mid pair against a river pro bet either. Let's just have a quick look at draw completes and see how wide we should be calling 3-bet pots at 26. So it kind of becomes like mid pair plus on draw completing river. And then on bricking river, let's just have a look. 30. Well, now it just starts to become low pairs again. All right. So even on draw completing river, there's a good argument for not folding second pair, I guess. All right. Thanks for your attention, guys. Hopefully it was helpful. Good luck with the grind, and I'll see you next time.